Discipleship groups, this week we have been in Mark chapter 4, and I hope it has been a fruitful time in God's Word. I'd like to spend a couple minutes talking about the purpose of parables and some of the significant things that happen in Mark chapter 4, and then just encourage you as you go. So, parables. On page 87 in your Mark commentary, there's a really interesting page about just the purpose of parables. I would encourage you, check that out. Parables were the primary way that Jesus taught in his ministry here on earth. And so it's important for us on how to digest and understand and walk away with fruitful application from that. There's two things I'd like to point out. And parables were meant to shock the original audience and even shock us with kind of absurd things in its teaching. The second thing and the main thing that parables were called to do is they're called to point to Jesus and this new kingdom he's establishing as the Messiah, and then call us, the readers and the original audience, to a decision. You see this call to a decision in Mark chapter 4, verse 12, and it says that they might turn back and be forgiven. You see, all these parables were to help us understand this new kingdom that Jesus was coming to initiate and to call us as the readers towards a decision. So as we read that and we read these parables, the question should become, how does this point to the Messiah, and what decision is it calling me to make? And so we see several different parables, and I'm not going to walk through all of them, but I want to just look at the parable of the sower, which is these seeds being scattered and by a farmer, and then it falling on different types of soil. We have a hard soil, we have a shallow soil, we have like a thorny soil, and then we have a fruitful soil. And all of these illustrate in different ways, and Jesus actually explains this parable, which is really helpful. But I begin to ask, what type of soil do you identify with? Are you growing up? Were you a hard soil, a shallow soil? Are you a shallow, distracted soil maybe that's being choked out? Are you seeing fruit in your life? Would you classify yourself as being in this fruitful soil? I think it's interesting. I know for me, I feel at times where I am in this soil where I'm among thorns and we get choked out. And I think as a society, many of us might fall under that classification, just being really distracted, having a lot of things that choke out the good news of the gospel. We see, going from there, we see these additional parables. And one thing that I love about this chapter is that it's really easy to digest and begin to understand some of the things that Jesus is teaching. We see in the parable of the seed being scattered, the sovereignty of God, and how some of it is outside of our control. And the only thing we're called to do is scatter seed, and he's the one that brings the growth. Mark chapter 4 closes out with this shift from parables to this story of Jesus calming the sea, and the disciples are freaking out while Jesus is asleep in the boat. And it begins it's reiterating a truth that we've already talked about at some level, the authority that Jesus has. So Jesus spends Mark chapter 4 talking about this new kingdom he's coming to initiate. And then Mark chapter 4 closes with him reminding them through this event that happened of the authority that he has as the Son of God. And then we'll see in Mark chapter 5 as Jesus does some pretty crazy stuff, from driving out demons to some other things where it's an additional stories and events of Jesus' authority. And it's important to remember that Mark chapter 4 the whole book of Mark is intended to remind the reader of his authority as he's come to initiate this kingdom. And so, groups, as you begin your discussion, I'd just like to encourage you. I know that the past month has probably been busy for a lot of us, and I just want to commend you and say thank you for investing in time in God's Word. And I am praying that the Lord will just speak to you in your group time as you spend time individually with God's Word. And maybe just spend some time praying for one another as you close tonight, or your time gathering with your group. And so, groups, I love you, and I am just anticipating God to continue moving in and through your lives. And next week we'll be reading Mark chapter 5. And so be sure to grab a study guide. We'll text those out, but it's also in the description of this video.